You never imagine it'll be the people closest to you. You hear stories, rumors, scandals, but those always happen to someone else. Not you. Not your life. And especially not the two people you trusted with everything. My days used to start the same way. Coffee at the kitchen island, Emma humming some pop melody while she poured cereal, and Mark, my business partner, texting in updates before our morning stand-ups. It was a rhythm, not perfect, but familiar. Safe. We had dinner together, the three of us sometimes, usually after long work days. I joke that Emma and Mark spent more time with each other than I did with either of them. We all laughed. I laughed. But now, those memories taste different. Bitter. Tarnished. We built something real, not just a company, but a shared dream. Long nights coding, strategizing, arguing over design decisions, celebrating milestones with cheap champagne in the early days. Mark had been there from the beginning. And Emma? She was my rock during the chaos. She believed in the business even when the profits weren't showing. Supported me, or so I thought. There were signs. Not loud ones, whispers, really. A pause in conversation when I entered the room. The way Emma's smile looked strained after certain phone calls. Mark excusing himself from meetings more often. His phone glued to his hand with a kind of nervous urgency. But I explained those things away. Startup stress. Too many late nights. When you're building something, frayed nerves are expected. And besides, I was happy. Or convinced myself I was. We were growing, both the business and the life Emma and I had planned. We were even looking at houses just a few months ago. She sent me listings in the middle of meetings, giddy about hardwood floors and southern-facing windows. I thought she was nesting. Turns out, she was planning her exit. I remember one night in particular, the three of us on the patio, wine glasses in hand, the startup finally showing profit. We toasted under string lights Mark had helped me hang. Emma had leaned back in her chair, laughing at some joke Mark made. Her head tilted back in that way that used to make my chest swell. That night I felt content, proud. How naive that version of me was. In hindsight, the closeness between them wasn't subtle. I just didn't want to see it. Business partners spend time together. Friends share inside jokes. And I wanted to believe that trust was still a currency we all valued. I wanted to believe in the bubble we'd built. Denial is a powerful thing. Because when you're happy or trying to be, you don't search for cracks. You run your fingers over the surface and call it smooth. You ignore the chill in her voice when she says she's tired. You excuse the missed calls and unreturned texts. You let Mark's evasiveness slide because he's your partner, your friend, your brother in all but blood. And when it all begins to crumble, when the mask slips and reality barges in without warning, it doesn't do it with a bang. It starts with a silence, a pause in the rhythm, a day where something feels off. That day started with breakfast and ended with a question I didn't yet know I was asking. What happens when the two people you trust most betray you? Not just behind your back, but right in front of your blind eyes. I was about to find out. It began with small things. Daniel picking up client calls when I was in back-to-back meetings. Drafting proposals I usually would have reviewed myself. Don't worry, he'd say. I've got it. And I let him. Because at the time it felt like loyalty, like partnership, like the weight wasn't only mine to carry anymore. The business was growing fast, faster than we'd prepared for. Investors were circling, contracts piling up, my inbox flooding daily with decisions that needed yesterday's answers. It was chaos, yes, but the kind I had once thrived in. Until I didn't. Emma started nudging me to slow down. Subtle at first. A hand on my shoulder when I burned through dinner at my desk. A reminder that sleep wasn't optional. Let Daniel take the lead on a few things, she said one night, resting her head on my chest as we lay in the dark. You need rest. You'll burn out. She wasn't wrong. My energy was fraying. The nights blurred together, the pressure mounting. And Daniel was there, ever dependable, always 2 steps ahead. It felt good to have someone pick up the slack. Someone I trusted implicitly. I didn't realize I was handing over keys, one by one, until I was the one knocking on the door. Daniel started making decisions without looping me in. Justified them with speed and efficiency. You were swamped, he said. I figured it was better to keep things moving. And I believed him. Or rather, I wanted to. Because questioning him felt like questioning everything we'd built. Besides, Emma agreed. You don't have to carry everything, she told me more than once. Let him help. So I did. He attended a few meetings solo. Then more. He redrafted our pitch deck and presented it to an investor without telling me until after. I should have seen that as a warning, not a betrayal, not yet, but a signal that something was shifting. Instead, I chalked it up to proactiveness. Daniel was just stepping up. When he suggested we open a second office, I hesitated. Expansion wasn't part of the immediate roadmap. But he was persuasive, convincing. Emma encouraged it too. He's got vision, she said. It's good to have someone who pushes the envelope. It was always Emma smoothing over my doubts. Not in a manipulative way, not overtly. She made it sound like support. Like she was looking out for me. You've earned a break, she told me over dinner one night. Let Daniel take the reins for a bit. And so I stepped back. Just a little. Then a little more. That's when I noticed things shifting, documents I hadn't seen but had my name on them. Meetings I didn't know happened. Clients referring to decisions I supposedly made. I'd laugh it off, thinking Daniel had just forgotten to CC me or update the shared calendar. It never occurred to me that I was being gently moved aside. Emma's voice was always the echo behind Daniel's suggestions. Let him lead this campaign, you should really unplug this weekend, Daniel's been handling it well, hasn't he? Looking back, it was too synchronized to be coincidence. But in the moment, I mistook their alliance for shared care. I didn't know they were building something not with me, but around me. Or worse, without me. And I handed them the blueprint. It was supposed to be another long night at the office, back-to-back meetings with a potential investor, followed by a working dinner that Daniel insisted I attend. But then, without warning, the evening collapsed. A single email, client canceled, let's regroup tomorrow. Just like that, my schedule evaporated. I remember staring at the screen for a few seconds, unsure what to do with the unexpected space. So I drove home. There was no plan behind it. No suspicion. Just the quiet allure of a free evening, the thought of seeing Emma before midnight for once. Maybe we'd have dinner together, maybe just sit on the couch and not talk about work. I missed that. I missed her. The house was dim when I stepped in. The kind of lighting you don't think to adjust when you're not expecting anyone. I kicked off my shoes quietly, half thinking I'd surprise her with my presence. For a moment, I just stood there, listening. That's when I heard it, her voice. Soft. Familiar. But not the kind of familiar reserved for me. I couldn't make out the words, only the tone. It was low, warm, threaded with something close to affection. A murmur that sent something cold creeping up my spine. I took a step forward, careful, slow. The sound cut off. Silence. Then the hurried click of a phone being set down. Emma appeared in the hallway seconds later, a startled expression frozen on her face. Her hand hovered near the counter where her phone sat, face down. She blinked at me as if I were a stranger. You're home early, she said. Yeah. Meeting got canceled. I watched her closely. The quick flush of color in her cheeks. The half step she took back before recovering. I was just on a work call, she added, too casually. Nothing important. I nodded, pretending to accept it. Pretending it didn't sound rehearsed. She moved to hug me, but I hesitated for a heartbeat too long before returning it. The scent of her perfume lingered, familiar and distant all at once. My mind chased that tone I'd heard, not the words, just the feeling behind them. I wanted to ask who she'd been speaking to, but I didn't. Instead, I let her talk about dinner, about some article she read, about the things couples talk about when pretending everything is fine. Because I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe in the woman I married, in the house we made, in the life I thought we were still living. I didn't want to dissect tone and timing. I didn't want to think about the way her voice softened like that for someone else. So I swallowed the unease and told myself I was being paranoid. Stress can twist perception. That's what I told myself. But that night, when she fell asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling and replayed the moment, her jump, her flush, the way her eyes darted to her phone before settling on me. She wasn't expecting me. And I was starting to wonder why. The shift was subtle at first, a meeting I didn't know about until it was already over. A decision Daniel made on our behalf that I hadn't been consulted on. When I asked about it, he brushed it off with a grin. Didn't want to bother you, man. You've got enough on your plate. He wasn't wrong. My plate was full. But that wasn't the point. I tried to ignore it. Told myself this was just what growth looked like, delegation, trust, partnerships adapting under pressure. Daniel was stepping up, that's all. That's what I kept saying. But then it happened again. And again. Strategy sessions moved to times I wasn't available. Clients were looped in on revised timelines I hadn't reviewed. It became harder to track what was happening in the business I co-founded. And every time I raised a concern, Daniel would deflect, always with the same polished ease. "We thought you were taking a step back," he'd say, glancing at Emma like she might back him up, and she usually did. "You've been working so hard," she reminded me over dinner one night, her fork dancing through her untouched salad. "You said yourself you needed a breather." Had I said that? She was right in a way. I had been exhausted. I had let Daniel lead just for a little while. But now that I wanted back in, the door didn't open so easily. At home, Emma started drifting too. Not just emotionally, physically. Her phone became a constant shield, her gaze always fixed downward. She started going to bed earlier, saying she was tired. When I joined her, she'd already be curled away from me, the air between us thick with unspoken distance. I kept telling myself it was the business, the pressure, the stress of scaling something we'd built from nothing. People change under pressure, right? But it wasn't just the business that was changing. It was her. Conversations became brief, functional. Her laughter, once so easy, became rare. She stopped asking about my day. When I talked about new ideas, she seemed distracted, as if she'd already heard them before. Sometimes I caught her texting late at night, the screen lighting up her face while she smiled faintly. She always said it was a friend or someone from work. I didn't press, because the alternative, the possibility of something deeper, something darker, was still too much to face. At work, I found myself increasingly out of the loop. I'd walk into the office and see people exchanging looks, hesitating before speaking. One day, I overheard a new hire ask someone if I was still involved in the company. They whispered, but I heard it. I wasn't even angry, just numb. I was being erased. Not loudly, not violently, but methodically, like chalk fading from a board with every pass of a dry cloth. Bit by bit, part by part. At home, Emma barely touched me anymore. Her affection had cooled into a kind of polite tolerance. She still said the right things when we were around others, still played the role. But in private, it was different. Hollow. And through it all, Daniel stood by, helpful and present and always one step ahead. I started to wonder, was this still my life? My business? My marriage? Or had I simply become a placeholder? Convenient when needed, quietly set aside when not? I didn't have the answer, but I was beginning to suspect the truth. The house was unusually quiet that morning. Emma was in a rush, half-dressed, brushing her hair with one hand while sipping coffee with the other. She kissed my cheek out of habit, not affection, grabbed her bag, and hurried out the door with a muttered apology for running late. I stood in the kitchen, watching the door swing shut, the echo of her footsteps fading down the walkway. Just another rushed morning. Nothing unusual, until I turned and saw her phone sitting on the edge of the counter. It was unlike her to forget it. That thing might as well have been grafted to her hand these past few months. Always flipped downward, always with her, even in the bathroom. At first, I told myself not to touch it. It wasn't mine. Whatever suspicions I had, I wasn't that kind of husband. But then the screen lit up. Just a single preview. One message. "Last night was perfect." From Daniel. For a moment, I thought my mind had tricked me. That maybe it was an old message. Maybe he was referring to a client dinner. A meeting. Anything else. I wanted to believe that. I needed to. But the timestamp said otherwise. It had been sent 20 minutes earlier. Long after I'd gone to bed. Long after Emma said she was working late and came home smelling like wine and vanilla. A scent I hadn't smelled in years. Not on her anyway. I stared at that message like it was a bullet, my hand frozen mid-reach. The words weren't explicit. They didn't need to be. The intimacy was in their simplicity. The kind of message you send when no explanations are necessary. When a secret is already shared. And that's when it all began to click. The subtle shifts. The private jokes I wasn't part of. The decisions made behind closed doors. The way Emma had defended Daniel's growing influence at work. Her encouragement that I rest. Her soft reassurances that everything was fine. That I was imagining things. I wasn't. I stood in that kitchen with the hum of the refrigerator behind me, the dull morning light pouring in through the blinds, and felt something collapse inside. Not an explosion, not a breakdown, just a silence. The kind that fills the space when something fundamental is lost. I didn't scroll further. I didn't dig through her photos or open the message. I didn't need to. That single line was enough. It confirmed what my instincts had been screaming for weeks. Months, maybe? They were building something. And I had never been part of it. I set the phone back on the counter exactly where I'd found it and walked upstairs in a daze. I sat on the edge of the bed we once shared and looked around the room like a stranger, noticing for the first time how distant everything felt. How far away she'd already gone. She just never told me. Or maybe I just never forced her to. Either way, the truth was no longer something I could ignore. It had found me. In 8 glowing characters on a forgotten phone. I'd always imagined confrontation as something loud. Explosive. Voices raised, emotions spilling over. But when the moment finally came, it wasn't anything like that. It was quiet. Almost clinical. Like the aftermath of a storm, the damage already done, the screaming wind long gone. She came home late. Again. I was sitting at the dining table, lights low, her forgotten phone resting in front of me like a sealed confession. She didn't notice it at first. Or maybe she did and pretended not to. She dropped her keys in the bowl by the door, kicked off her shoes, and paused when she saw me sitting there. Something in her face shifted, not fear, not guilt. Just a flicker of understanding. Like she'd been waiting for this moment too. I didn't raise my voice. I couldn't. My throat was dry, my chest tight. It's him, isn't it? The words came out smaller than I'd intended. But they filled the room. She didn't ask who. Didn't fake confusion. Didn't deflect. Her eyes, those same eyes that used to light up when she looked at me, didn't flinch. She just said, "I'm sorry." That was it. No frantic backpedaling. No barrage of justifications or denials. Just those 2 words. Hollow and honest at the same time. I felt the weight of them land somewhere deep, not in my gut, not in my heart, but in that unnameable space where hope used to live. I wanted her to deny it. I needed her to lie, to fight, to scream, to make it murky. But she didn't. She just stood there, arms limp at her sides, eyes tired. Like the act of hiding it had been heavier than the truth. I nodded slowly, though I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to. The silence between us grew unbearable, pressing against my temples like a vice. How long? I finally asked. She didn't answer. Didn't need to. The answer was in everything, in the way she drifted, the way Daniel had stepped into my role without resistance, the way I'd been made to feel like a guest in my own life. It hadn't started last night. It had been going on for a while. And I'd missed it. No, I'd refused to see it. I stood up, unable to look at her any longer. The room felt too small, the air too thick. She didn't follow me. Didn't reach for my arm or try to stop me. That silence hurt more than anything she could have said. More than betrayal, more than the message on her phone, more than Daniel's quiet coup, it was her stillness that finally broke me. Because it told me the truth I wasn't ready to face. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry I'd found out. The next morning, I didn't go to the office. I couldn't. The idea of sitting across from Daniel, pretending everything was fine, made my skin crawl. But I also knew I couldn't avoid him forever. So I called him. "We need to talk," I said. My voice was flat. Measured. He didn't ask what about. He just said, sure, like he'd been expecting it. We met at a cafe near the office, one of those polished, sterile places with chrome fixtures and exposed brick. I sat at a small table near the window watching the city move, trying to settle the storm inside me. He arrived 5 minutes late, as always. Cool. Relaxed. Like this was just another meeting. When he saw me, his expression didn't change. Not a flicker of discomfort. No trace of guilt. Just that same practiced calm he always wore when he thought he had the upper hand. He slid into the seat across from me and gave a nod. "You look like hell," he said, half smirking. I didn't reply. I just looked him in the eye and asked, "How long has it been going on?" He didn't blink. Didn't shift. Just leaned back in his chair like he was settling into a familiar rhythm. "A while," he said. That was it. A while. No apology. No defense. Just the confirmation I already knew was coming. "I trusted you," I said. The words felt pointless, like throwing pebbles at a wall. He shrugged, still wearing that half-smile. "You were too distracted to notice." And there it was. The truth said out loud. That I'd been working too hard. That I'd leaned on him too much. That I'd let Emma's reassurances lull me into a fog. That while I was building a company, they were building something else entirely. Together. That smile, it wasn't cruel. That would have been easier to hate. It was casual. Like he was explaining the weather. Like this betrayal had been inevitable, and I was simply late to the realization. You made it easy, he added, stirring his coffee like we were talking about business metrics. You stopped showing up. At work. At home. Someone had to step in. The audacity of it stunned me. He didn't see it as betrayal. He saw it as a correction. As if they had done me a favor, taken something I'd abandoned and claimed it as their own. I stood up. Not because I had anything left to say, but because if I stayed any longer, I didn't trust myself to keep quiet. He looked up at me with that same smirk, unbothered. You're not the first guy to lose track of what matters. I left before I could respond, because if I did, I might have said something I couldn't take back. Outside, the cold hit me like a slap. The world moved on, indifferent. Horns blared, people walked past on phones, and somewhere behind me, Daniel probably finished his coffee like nothing had changed. But everything had. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident. It was a decision. And they had made it together. It didn't happen overnight, though in hindsight it feels like it did. One day I was CEO, co-founder, leader. The next, I was just a name on a plaque being unscrewed from the door. The weeks following that meeting with Daniel blurred into a haze of paperwork, forced smiles, and growing paranoia. Every time I stepped into the office, I could feel the shift, the glances, the quick hush of conversations, the polite but distant greetings from people who once called me by nickname. I tried to hold on. I showed up to meetings, offered ideas, sent emails, but the silence in return was louder than any rejection. Daniel had filled the space I used to occupy. Seamlessly, strategically. Emma stopped asking how my days were, stopped pretending. Some mornings she didn't even come home. Said she was crashing at a friend's after late meetings. I didn't ask who. I already knew. The final blow came on a Thursday. I was called into what was labeled a strategic review. The board was there, Daniel too, sitting at the head of the table like he'd always belonged there. There were nods. There were rehearsed speeches. Phrases like, new direction, fresh leadership, sustainable restructuring. I barely heard it. I just watched Daniel's face. That slight smile that never reached his eyes. The way he looked at me. Not with triumph, but with inevitability. Emma wasn't in the room, but she might as well have been. Her voice had been in his ear for months. I saw it now. The timing. The way their narratives aligned. I wondered how many of our private conversations had become ammunition in his hands. How many things I'd told her in confidence were turned into evidence that I was losing my grip. When the vote was called, no one made eye contact. A unanimous decision. My name. Removed. Just like that. I was escorted out, not by security, but by some fresh-faced assistant who kept apologizing without ever saying the word. She handed me a cardboard box. My things had already been packed. A mug, a few notepads, a framed photo of Emma and me. Smiling, younger, unaware of what was coming. I walked past desks filled with people who once looked up to me. None of them stood. A few gave tight, sympathetic smiles. Most looked away. The elevator ride down was the longest of my life. I stared at the numbers blinking by, each floor a step further from the life I'd built, from the version of me that believed trust was enough. Outside, the wind hit hard. I stood on the sidewalk holding a box that somehow felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried. It wasn't the weight of the items. It was the weight of erasure. They'd taken everything. My company, my marriage, my name on the letterhead. My place in the world I'd helped create. And all that was left was this box. A box of memories I no longer recognized. I used to think identity was rooted in what you build. Your work, your relationships, the roof you put over someone's head, the name on the door. But when all of that is stripped away, when the walls you raised are handed to someone else, you realize what truly belongs to you. And what never did. In the weeks after the board vote, the rest unraveled quickly. Emma filed for divorce with surgical precision. The documents arrived on thick, expensive paper, like a final insult wrapped in civility. No call, no conversation, just her signature above mine, waiting. The house went with her. I didn't fight for it. I didn't want to. Every room felt like a monument to deceit, a space I had filled only for someone else to claim it. Let her have the kitchen where she smiled at texts meant for him. Let him have the office where I stayed up late, building a future that wasn't mine. Daniel remained in my chair at the company. I saw him on the cover of an industry magazine a few weeks later, smiling, confident, the kind of feature I used to dream of. The article called him a visionary leader. I didn't read past the headline. Friends stopped calling. Some were quiet out of discomfort, others out of convenience. In betrayal's wake, silence spreads fast. The story had reached them, but not the truth, just the version Emma and Daniel had scripted. I'd stepped down. I needed time. They painted themselves as the ones left behind to pick up the pieces. But I didn't correct the narrative. Let them talk. Because beneath the humiliation, beneath the grief, something else had started to grow. Not rage, not exactly. It was something colder, cleaner. Like the pain had burned off the parts of me that used to hesitate. They took everything. But they didn't take what I'd learned. And they didn't take my name. I still had that. And I still had time. So I started small. Quiet. A new workspace in a rented room above a bookstore. No logos. No buzz. Just a laptop, a notepad, and a mind sharper than it had been in years. I didn't need their money. I didn't need their circle. What I needed was a clean foundation. One they couldn't touch. I worked at odd hours, fueled by coffee and silence. No distractions. No illusions. Just the clarity that comes after losing everything you thought mattered. And slowly, something began to take shape. An idea, raw, real, forged not out of ambition, but out of survival. Every night, I wrote down what they'd taught me, where I'd ignored the signs. Where I'd given too much. Where I'd let trust replace vigilance. Not to wallow, but to remember. Because memory, I realized, is armor. They could keep the house, the boardroom, the reputation they'd repackaged as their own. But I had something they didn't, truth. And the quiet fire of a man they thought was finished. There's a strange quiet that comes after collapse. Not peace, not right away, but stillness. The kind that settles in your bones when there's nothing left to fight for and no one left to explain yourself to. In that silence, I started breathing again. Not the way I used to, not with ease or innocence, but deliberately. Slowly. As if each inhale was a decision to keep going. The first few months were brutal. There were days I didn't speak to anyone. Days where I'd stare at the wall and feel the weight of everything I'd lost pressing into my ribs. The company. The house. The relationship I thought was unshakable. I had handed over my world, brick by brick, only to be pushed out of the door I helped build. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. There were no grand breakthroughs. No cinematic montages of recovery. Just small, defiant acts, waking up early. Saying no to bitterness. Sketching out business plans in the corner of a coffee shop no one knew me in. Making things again, not for applause, not for investors, just for the sake of proving I could. Time didn't heal everything. But it gave me distance. And with distance came clarity. I stopped replaying the conversations. Stopped dissecting the nights Emma came home late, the emails Daniel sent without CCing me, the boardroom nods that sealed my fate. I stopped asking why. Because betrayal doesn't always come with answers. Sometimes it just is. And maybe that's what hurt most, not that they conspired, but that they didn't feel the need to explain. Like I was an obstacle, not a person. Like I was always meant to be a stepping stone. But that's the thing about people like Daniel and Emma, they believe power is about taking. About replacing. About claiming space they didn't earn. They were wrong. I own a new company now. Mine alone. No partners. No hidden agendas. No voices whispering behind doors. It's smaller. Leaner. Built from the ground up again. But every inch of it is real. No borrowed loyalty. No second guessing. I sign every deal myself. Shake every hand with eyes wide open. Some of the people who once ghosted me are starting to reach out again. I answer politely, but I don't invite them in. That version of me, the one who needed everyone's approval, doesn't exist anymore. The man I am now? He remembers. He forgives, maybe. But he doesn't forget. And he's still standing. Stronger than they ever expected.